This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you everyone for coming. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with you. Actually, I want to thank Rabbi Mitteldorf for inviting me. Me and Rabbi Mitteldorf go back many, many years. Baruch Hashem, I've been zeichet to see how Rabbi Mitteldorf has become one of the premier Rabbeim here in New York. And actually we go back, we learned for our bar mitzvahs together, right? We both learned to learn our parashas together. We were in the same little chabura. And if I may say, many years ago, Rabbi Mitteldorf had a basketball team, and me and him were, I was trying to keep up with Rabbi Mitteldorf on the court a little bit, but Baruch Hashem, it's a pleasure to see all the Talmidim and to see my Chaverim, having the Rabbi Feiler, who we go back many years with, Rabbi Stern, and Rabbi Edelstein, of course, who we also go back many years together with. So I just want to speak for a few moments. It's an interesting thing. You know, we all know people go to Eretz Yisrael and they get brachas from Gedolim, and they're able to see Gedolim in action and to see them in their lifetimes. But the question is, what are we trying to accomplish by going to the Beis Olam, by going to the Beis HaKvaros? Here are these Gedolim, they're buried already, they're in the world of truth, they're in the Olam HaEmes. So what exactly are we trying to accomplish? So just a very brief idea. Do you remember in the end of Parshas Behaloischa, where Miriam speaks some type of Lashon Hara about Moshe Rabbeinu, and she criticizes Moshe Rabbeinu, and the Reuvain Shem is upset because the Reuvain Shem considered that what Miriam said to be Lashon Hara, and the Reuvain Shem wants to come and give Musar to Miriam, reprimand Miriam, and the pasuk uses a very unusual expression. The pasuk says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu calls Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says to Moshe, Aaron and Miriam, all you three, leave the Oyel Moed. So Moshe leaves, and Aaron leaves, and Miriam leaves, and they're all standing together. And then Hashem tells Moshe, Moshe, step aside. And then the Reuvain Shem gives Musar to Aaron and Miriam. And Moshe is not even speaking to Moshe. So the question is, if Hashem is not speaking to Moshe, why did Hashem tell Moshe to leave the Oyel Moed, stand together with Miriam and Aaron? Here Hashem says to Moshe, Moshe, go with them. And then once he goes with them, he tells him to leave. So there's a Ran, a very interesting Ran. The Ran says that the Gedolei Yisrael, the greatest leaders of the generation, I don't like to use this expression, but it's a good mashal anyway. A Gadol b'Yisrael is like a Wi-Fi zone. You know, you want to pick up a connection, so you need to create a point of hiskashrus, a point of connection. A Gadol b'Yisrael is, so to speak, the Wi-Fi zone between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Klal Yisrael. So that if you sit next to a Gadol b'Yisrael, if you stand next to a Gadol b'Yisrael, if you're connected to a Gadol b'Yisrael, if you stay close to a Gadol b'Yisrael, and not just not just a Gadol, even your own Rabbeim. You know, how does a person get Yiras Shamayim? You know, Baruch Hashem, I've been in yeshiva many years. I learned in yeshiva over 20 years. And if you want, I learned in yeshiva Chofetz Chaim. Thank you. Shkayach, we'll save that for later, yeah. Okay, we'll do that later. Not bad, we'll do that later. So, if you want to know which Talmidim end up being the most successful, not only in the yeshiva, but in life in general, it's Talmidim who develop relationships with the Rabbeim. It's the hashpah that the Rabbeim have on them. It stays with them for the rest of their life. Not just in learning. You know, you see your Rebbe leaving the yeshiva, you walk him to your car, you walk him to his car. You see your Rebbe by lunch, you sit down next to him. You want to eat with the Rebbe, you want to spend time with the Rebbe, you want to talk to the Rebbe, see how the Rebbe lives. Because your Rebbe is your Wi-Fi zone. It helps you connect to the Ribbono Shel Olam. So the Ran says like this: the Ribbono Shel Olam wanted to speak to Aaron and Miriam, but they were not on the Madrega for HaKadosh Baruch Hu to speak to them. They needed Wi-Fi connection. So Hashem goes to Moshe Rabbeinu, and he says, Moshe, stand next to Miriam and Aaron. So Moshe goes and he stands there. That establishes the connection. So then Hashem tells Moshe, okay, you're done. We don't need you anymore. Step aside. And once Moshe established the lines of communication, Hashem then was able to address Aaron and Miriam. What's this got to do with the Beis Olam? Says Iran, this is the reason we go to a cemetery. It's interesting. People go and they stand at a kever, And you can make a very big mistake. Sometimes people daven at a kever, and they say, Harav Hagoin, help me, do this for me. You're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to daven directly to somebody who passed away. The Chai Adam even writes, it's a lav in the Torah, Lo Sidroi Shel HaMesim. You can't make requests of Mesim. You can't make requests of somebody who passed away. We believe one of the Yud Gimel Ikrim is an imamin be'amunah shalema, shehaboire yisparach shemoi, loy levadoi roi lehispalel ve'en lezulas roi lehispalel. You're only allowed to pray straight to the Ribbono Shel Olam. You can't pray to somebody else to help you. So what are we doing at a kever? Says the Ran, this Gadol B'Yisrael was connected to the Ribbono Shel Olam when he was alive. And therefore, even after he passed away, his place where he rests eternally is a point of connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so that when I stand there, I tap into the zone. I have an opportunity to daven in a place which the lines of communication are much stronger than anywhere else. You know, sometimes I'm learning in my shul. I don't know if any of you guys live in the 5 towns. I have a shul on the corner of, where is it again? On Peninsula and Branch. And I'm learning in the shul, and sometimes I get a phone call, but I don't like to talk on the cell phone in the shul, so I step outside, and there's a place on the corner, it's like a dead zone. Every time I step out there, it's like, I lose the call drops. Because there's some places where you're connected, you have better connection, and some places, the antennas, the satellites, they're not working as well. It's the same thing in tefillah. We could always daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, He's always listening to us, but there are places that are more conducive for tefillah than other places. And says the Ran, these places are the places where tzadikim are buried. So we're going to go today, Be'ezus Hashem, to the kever of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. We're going to go to the kever of Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky, Be'ezus Hashem, Rav Pam, Rav Shlomo Heiman, Rav Reuvain Grozovsky. These are people who were mizdabek. They connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in their lifetime, and therefore even la'achar misasam, when we stand there, it is a unique opportunity that the Ribbono Shel Olam is listening even more intently. We're able to daven with even more kayach, with even more kavana, with even more energy. So I hope, Be'ezus Hashem, that all of our tefillah should be niskabel. If I may, so you want to know, what should I daven for? What should I pray for? What should I ask the Ribbono Shel Olam? So I'll tell you a little story. There was one of the great Rosh Yeshiva of all time, the Rosh Yeshiva of Grodno, Reb Shimon Shkop. Probably you've heard maybe some of your Rabbeim say over a Torah from Reb Shimon Shkop. And Reb Shimon Shkop was learning in Volozhin. And the Rosh Yeshiva then was the Netziv. And Reb Shimon Shkop, he liked his Rebbe, but he wasn't sold yet. He wasn't sold on the Rebbe. And Reb Shimon Shkop was learning Rashbam and Baba Basra. And the Netziv walked in after midnight. And Reb Shimon Shkop said, well, okay, it's an opportunity to ask my Rebbe a question. So he calls his Rebbe over. He says, Rebbe, could you help me explain this Rashbam? So the Netziv looks at the Rashbam, and the Netziv says, this Rashbam? Do you know how many Kvarim I visited so that I should understand this Rashbam? And Reb Shimon Shkop was blown away. That he knew his Rebbe was such a masmid, he knew his Rebbe was a lamdin, but that he should spend so much tefillah just to understand one Rashbam. Sometimes you learn Gemara, and you say, it's very hard. I don't get what's going on. What's this all about? Yeah, I basically understand it, but I'm not getting the whole thing. So we have to daven. You have to daven to Ribbono Shel Olam, please help me. That learning should not just be something I do, something that I study for tests. I want to enjoy the learning. I want the learning to be coursing through my veins. I want it to become part of me. I want to understand it deeply so that it's meaningful to me. We have to daven for that. We want to daven that the Ribbono Shel Olam help us make Talmud Torah a real part of our lives. This is one of the things we could daven for. Obviously, we want to daven for our health. We want to daven for our success in everything in life. We want to daven for our parents, for our families, for our friends. But most importantly, we want to daven that Hashem should help us in our ruchnias, to help us grow. And it's really a great honor to be together with you, to be together with your Chashuv Rabbeim, and look forward. We'll be spending some more time very soon in the Beis HaKvaros. Reuvain Shem should be makabel all of our tefillos. Barachamim uvratzon. Shkoyach. Everyone, it's really a very special moment to be here at the kever of Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, the Satmar Rebbe, is reputed to have said that of all the kvarim in America, this is actually the most significant kever in America. It's rare to have a kever of a gadol who's actually a student, the Talmud Muvak of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef lived from 1843 to 1902, and he was the first to occupy the following position. In the late 19th century in America, just to describe the way America was in the late 19th century, there were no kosher pizza stores. Can you imagine? There was no sushi. There were no kosher restaurants. Probably 8 out of every 10 marriages that were taking place in America were intermarriage. Just to give you a little picture. My grandfather grew up in the Bronx in the 1930s. He went to RJJ, that's the yeshiva. Rabbi Yaakov Yosef is the name RJJ, Rabbi Jacob Joseph School, is named after Rabbi Yaakov Yosef. In the Bronx in the 1930s, there were 600,000 Jews. Only 600 went to yeshiva. Okay, just to give you a little picture. And part of the problem was that in America they didn't have something called a kehillah like they had in Europe. In Europe they had a unified kehillah, meaning you had a shoichet, you had a bezdin, you had all the different aspects of Judaism were institutionalized under one kehillah. And the main reason they didn't have a kehillah in America is there was no chief rabbi. So they had this idea they were going to bring in the first chief rabbi of America. And who are they going to bring in? The most talented, the greatest Talmud Chacham, and aside from everything, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef was the world's greatest speaker. So already in Europe, when Rabbi Yaakov Yosef spoke, there were hundreds of people that would crowd the shul. So they made him an offer, and he demanded as follows, that he needs $5,000 up front. And the reason for that is, he was such a Baal Tzedakah, he was in debt to so many people for giving away his money for Tzedakah. He needed to pay off his debts before he came to America. And they gave it to him. $5,000 in the 19th century was a tremendous sum of money. And he figured he's going to come to America. He's going to have this position, Chief Rabbi of New York, the first Chief Rabbi of New York. And it will be a great aliyah for him. He'll be able to be Marbitz Torah. He'll be able to influence Klal Yisrael. He'll change the scene of America. And in 10 years, one of the Gedolei Hadar was reduced from the highest echelon of Gadol B'Yisrael to paralyzed invalid. He was bedridden, he could not move his limbs, he cannot talk, he suffered a debilitating stroke, and the main reason was because in America in the late 19th century, the butcher union was like a mafia, and they basically took him down. They made his life miserable. You know, when he came to America and the boat landed, there were tens of thousands of Jews greeting him with great kavod. He never had kavod again. The next time he had kavod was at his levaya, where there were 100,000 people at his levaya. He suffered maybe more than any other Gadol B'Yisrael who ever lived in America, and that's why the Satmar Rebbe said, this is the place to have your tefillos answered in the United States of America. Just to tell you one little story, you know, by the end of his life, he was paralyzed, he couldn't talk, he couldn't move his limbs, he couldn't give shiurim, and word went out, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef said, that he's going to be giving one last Shabbos Shuvah drasha. And people didn't even know, how's he going to speak? How's he going to talk? He can't even get a word out of his mouth. And he said, no, he's going to be carried into the Beis Medrash. The Beis Medrash fit 2,000 people. 3,000 people came that Shabbos to hear Rabbi Yaakov Yosef give the last Shabbos Shuvah drasha. And they hadn't seen him in a very long time. And all of a sudden, from the back of the shul, they carry in Rabbi Yaakov Yosef on a chair. He could barely speak, he could barely sit up, and they carry him to the podium, and he musters up the strength, and he stands at the podium, and like many Shabbos Shuvah drashas begin, he said the following, Shteit in the Rambam, it says in the Rambam. And everyone's looking at him, no, what's he going to say? Which Rambam? What does the Rambam say? And he couldn't remember. And he said, Nochamal. Shteit in the Rambam, it says in the Rambam. But he couldn't summon the Rambam, he couldn't remember the Rambam. And a third time he says, it says in the Rambam. And he breaks down crying. And he cries like a baby. He said, look what happens to a human being. Look what a human being could be reduced to. Look how short life is. Look at how vulnerable we are. And he got down, and that was the end of the drasha. And it is said there are many drashas given in the history of Klal Yisrael. This was perhaps the most powerful Shabbos Shuvah drasha that was ever given. If I could just share with you one Dvar Torah from Rabbi Yaakov Yosef on this week's Parsha, Parshas Kisavai. The pasuk says that Moshe Rabbeinu tells Klal Yisrael, today you've become a nation. Le'nasan Hashem lachem lev ladas ve'inayim lirois ve'oznayim l'shmaya ad hayom hazeh. That the Rebbeinu Shalom has not given you a seichel until today. And Rashi brings down what happened on that day that all of a sudden Moshe Rabbeinu says, today you've become a nation. So Rashi brings down the story that Moshe Rabbeinu gave a Sefer Torah to Shevet Levi, and Klal Yisrael thought that Moshe was only giving the Torah to Levi and was not giving them the Torah. And Klal Yisrael protested, and they said, we want the Torah also. Why are you only giving the Torah to Shevet Levi? So Moshe Rabbeinu said, finally you've become a nation. You care about the Torah. So Rabbi Yaakov Yosef asks, this story didn't happen yet. It won't happen until next week's Parsha, Vayelech, 2 weeks from now, where Moshe gives the Torah to Shevet Levi. Why is Moshe saying now I see you're a nation? It didn't happen now, it happens later. So Yaakov Yosef gives a mashal. Imagine a guy, he was hoping to get shlishi. He really wanted shlishi. And instead of getting shlishi, they give him galila. And the guy's beroig, the guy's angry. How dare you give me galila? I wanted shlishi. Does the guy really love the Torah, or he wants the kavod? Could be he wants the kavod, because it's nageh his own honor. He wanted the shlishi. How do you know if a guy really loves the Torah? Let's say you give him the toichacha, and he's still happy. So you see, the guy genuinely loves the Torah, because most people don't want the toichacha. So says Rabbi Yaakov Yosef in Parshas Kisavai, where Moshe Rabbeinu just said the toichacha, and even then Klal Yisrael said, give us the Torah. So that indicates they really want the Torah, because if you're happy to have even a toichacha, so clearly the Torah is something you love. So we should be zoiche that in this Makom Kodesh, all of our tefillos should be neskabel. We're going to ask the Menah, Rabbi Yerman, is going to lead us in Kapitel Tehillim. Okay, Chevra, we're here at the Kever of Shlomo Heiman. Rav Shlomo Heiman was one of the earliest Rosh Yeshiva of Tarvadas. I believe the second Rosh Yeshiva of Tarvadas. Anyone who learns the Yeshivisha Masechtas is familiar with Chidushay Rav Shlomo. It's very interesting. Chidushay Rav Shlomo was written by Rav Michael Yehuda Lefkowitz. He's the one who is the mechaber of the Chidushay Rav Shlomo. Shlomo Heiman lived a very short life. He was nifter in his 50s. He was the Talmud Muvak of Rav Baruch Ber. He learned 12 years by Rav Baruch Ber. In fact, when Rav Shlomo Heiman was appointed Rosh Yeshiva of Tarvadas, Rav Baruch Ber sent the following message, that it was kedai, all of his mother's chevlei leida, all of the labor pains of his mother were well worth it, that he should come to the world to have a student like Rav Shlomo Heiman. He had smicha from Rav Baruch Ber, he had smicha from Rav Chaim Oizer. In 1923, he gets the following invitation. Rav Chanan Wasserman invited Rav Shlomo Heiman to say shir in Baranovich. And then in 1935, by the way, he also gave shir in Vilna by Rav Chaim Oizer Grozovsky. And then in 1935, Rav Shagafayvo Mendelovich invites Rav Shlomo Heiman to become the Rosh Yeshiva of Tarvadas. He took over from Rav David Leibowitz, and he had a tremendous midah. First of all, I want to say over that he loved Rabbi Kiva Eger. He would say over a kasha Rabbi Kiva Eger, he would milk the Rabbi Kiva Eger. He would say it over this way, that way, this angle, examine it from every vantage point to try to extract from Rabbi Kiva Eger all the lumdus, all the juice from Rabbi Kiva Eger. But he had a very special midah that if a Talmud would ask a kasha, so for all your Rabbeim out there, sometimes a student asks a question, it's not a very good question, so what do? You move on. Rav Shlomo Heiman had this way, he would take the Talmud's kasha and paint it over and cover it over and say it over and make the kasha like a gavaldige kasha and sort of, change it up a little bit so to make the Talmud feel like that the Talmud's really asking a good question. Just want to say over 2 short insights of Rav Shlomo Heiman on Legabe the Yom Naram. He said that he once heard B'Shem Rav Itzla Blazer, Rav Itzla Petterberg. We say in the davening, Tiku b'chodesh shofar b'keseh Liyom Chagenu. We say that Rosh Hashanah is called Bakesa, it's hidden. So the simple pshat is, it's hidden because Rosh Hashanah is the beginning of the month when the moon is hidden. Rav Shlomo Heiman said a very powerful pshat. Every year on Rosh Hashanah, the Reuvain Shalom gives us a box. And in the box is the outcome for the upcoming year. But we don't know what's inside the box. We don't know if inside the box is a year of success and good health. Nobody knows what's inside the box. So Rosh Hashanah is Bakesa, it's a hidden day. We're given a fate, but we don't know what that fate is. And we hope through our tefillos we should be zoicha that fate should be a good fate, a fate of Shnas Chaim v'Shalom, Lanu u'Lechol Yisrael. Amen. We'll hold it over here. One of the Rabbi. Okay, we have a zchus to be at the kever of Rabbi Reuvain, Grozovsky. I know it's very hot. We're going to try to keep it bekitzer and try to take out of it as much as we can. Rabbi Reuvain was the son-in-law of Rabbi Baruch Ber. So at 1919, at 33 years old, Rabbi Reuvain marries Rabbi Baruch Ber's daughter. But Rabbi Reuvain was so makusher to his Rebbe, Rabbi Baruch Ber, and also he had another interesting midah. He was very careful in the way he spent money. He would not spend money excessively. So he figured he would accomplish the both together. He would move in with Rabbi Baruch Ber, watch his ways, and also be able to save on his expenses. And he observed Rabbi Baruch Ber his entire life. He was makusher to his Rebbe. He was already Rosh Hashiva in Kaminetsky. And during World War II, he escaped with some of his Talmidim. He came to the West Coast with Rabbi Aaron Kotler, came to probably San Francisco, and he was very involved in the Vad Hatzalah, so he was able to save about 110 of the Talmidim of Kamenetz. He brought them to America. He was very active in Agudas Yisrael. Many don't know that he was the head of the Mayeses Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael. He was the founder of Torah Masorah. Founder of Torah Masorah was Rabbi Reuvain Grozovsky. And then he's invited by Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich to become Rosh Hashiva Tarvadas, and simultaneously is also Rosh Hashiva of Beis Medrash Elyon. The schedule of Rabbi Reuvain could have knocked out the biggest gibor who ever lived. Just explain his daily schedule. Thursday night, he was up all night preparing for Friday morning shir. Friday night, he was up all night preparing for Sunday morning shir. He would go every single week without sleeping Thursday and Friday night. That means he basically went from Wednesday night, Thursday, Friday, Shabbos, more than 72 hours without sleep every single week. But what's a very big tragedy, as a young man also in his 50s, many of these Rosh Yeshiva passed away in their 50s. 6 years before he was nifter, he was hit by a car in a very suspicious incident. It was a hit and run, and for 6 years he was basically confined to his bed. And certain Hasidic Rebbe said that the world could not have been soivel the sudden passing of Rabbi Reuvain, so therefore the Rebbeinu Shalom bechazdoi, so to speak, took him away slowly, where already 6 years before he actually left this world, he was not able to function, not as Rosh Hashiva, not as head of Mayetzes Gedolei HaTorah, and not as the founder of Torah Masorah. But one of the greatest Rosh Yeshiva that we had in this country, Zechusa Yagin Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael. Rabbi, forum here, so it's almost hard to digest the awesome experience of going to all these Gedolei Yisrael. But one thing we have to bear in mind, these are the Ma'orei Yisrael, these are the luminaries of Klal Yisrael. They shine the light for us, not only b'chayim, but la'achar misasam. They give us direction even today, even though they're be'eretz hachayim, they still give us direction. It's a great zechus to be at the kever of Rabbi Yaakov Kaminetsky, who lived a very long life. He lived from 1891 to 1986. Just to share with you one brief midah. We all know that Rabbi Yaakov Sefer was the Emes Yaakov because he specialized in the midah of MS. Rabbi Yaakov said, "Miyom amdai al daitoi," from the day that his seichel hayashar was developed, he never said anything which was even a semblance of sheker. So just to share with you one dvar Torah that Rabbi Yaakov said, which is so apropos, l'misha oimer, he said an amazing thing. You know, the Ramban asks famously, how could Yaakov marry Rachel and Leah? How could Yaakov marry two sisters? And the Ramban answers, well, it's not a problem, because he married Rachel and Leah in Chutz La'aretz, and by the time he got to Eretz Yisrael, Rachel already died. And Yaakov only kept the Torah in Eretz Yisrael. But Rabbi Yaakov says that's not pshat in the Ramban. The Ramban is not asking how Yaakov can marry two sisters. How Yaakov can marry two sisters? He married them. Listen to how Rabbi Yaakov says it. He says Yaakov married Leah. That's how he married Leah. And how he married Rachel? He told Rachel, I'm going to marry you. He said, Evadcha sheishanim ba'avur Rachel betcha aktana. He said he's going to marry her. Says Rabbi Yaakov, if a Yid says something, you have to keep it no matter what. But it's against the Torah. It's before the Torah was given. Yaakov had a chumrah not to violate the Torah before it was given. So you're going to keep a chumrah and lie. It's much more important to keep your word than to keep the Torah before it was given. And therefore, says Rabbi Yaakov, Yaakov married 2 sisters because he said he would. The Ramban's kasha is not how could Yaakov marry 2 sisters. The Ramban's kasha is why did Hashem orchestrate it that Yaakov should have to violate his personal chumrah? And the answer is because he didn't. Because ultimately Rachel died before he got back into Eretz Yisrael, and he never ended up having to violate living with 2 sisters. But says Rabbi Yaakov a very interesting thing. Rabbi Yaakov says that if somebody gets engaged, they're bound to that agreement only because they said they would marry the person. Rabbi Yaakov's great teaching in this world is that a person is bound morally, ethically, halachically by the words that they say. That was the midah of Rabbi Yaakov, emes liYaakov's chusa yagin aleinu. Mishnah Brura. So we owe her a great debt of gratitude. All the halachas of all the Yomim Tovim, starting Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Chanukah, Purim, this is all to her credit. She should be Melitza Yisrael of Klal Yisrael.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.